Now, when you're in something like SEAL team, right, and you're doing all of this crazy stuff, putting your body under extreme amounts of duress and stress, this is the perfect way for us to begin to look at hormones. Ultimately, what the body is designed to do is it's designed to handle that stress up to a point. Right now, you all in your background, you push that to the absolute extreme, right? But let's just basically talk just briefly about how this system works. The body really likes to be exposed to short-term extreme stress or very long-term light stress. It really does not like the stuff in the middle. So this moderate intensity, long-term stress, not really good, or extreme stress over the long run. And so when you come out of a deployment like that and you go in and get your testosterone and your hormones checked, what's going to happen is especially your reproductive hormones are going to be in the tank. Why? Because the body's essentially going, look, we've got stress to manage. We do not have to worry about reproduction, and we shouldn't. And so most people are thinking, oh, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, these things are helping me with muscle and all these other things, and they are, but their primary job is to handle reproduction. And so when you stress out your system, your body's essentially saying, I do not want to be looking at reproduction. I want to be looking at survival. And so the first thing you look at, right? So if we're all you listeners following sort of Bear's sort of clinical example here, what we can look at and say, as that stress begins to build, you're going to start to see some signs and symptoms that are not having anything to do with testosterone. You're going to see hunger issues. You're going to see unpredictable, unstable energy. You're going to see craving issues. You're going to start seeing lack of performance. You're going to start seeing a lot of other things. So the first step when you're managing hormones is to get in touch with the language of metabolism. Metabolism doesn't speak Spanish or English. It speaks metabolism. And that language is a language of biofeedback. So when you start seeing hunger change, energy become unpredictable, unstable, cravings become unrelenting, sleep becoming fragmented and things like that, mood changes, exercise performance, exercise recovery, libido, erections, menses, headaches, joint pain, all of this stuff is a sign that the hormonal system is beginning to become compromised. Now that's step one. So once you see that, you know you're getting some hormonal issues popping up. Now, the next thing is body composition, right? Because all of this is going to influence whether you can attain or maintain optimal body composition. Now, for you all in the SEALs, obviously that's something that you are doing all the time. But for your average Jane or Joe, the next thing they want to look at is body composition, because if hormones are off, you're not going to be able to sustain a calorie deficit, and you're not going to be able to burn fat effectively and build muscle the way we all would like. So that's step two. One is biofeedback. Two is body composition. And then three is what you talked about, looking at blood labs and vitals. And so this, I'll give you a shortcut here with a funny little acronym I use called SHMEC, sleep, hunger, mood, energy, cravings, SHMEC. This is a window into your hormonal biofeedback. If your SHMEC is out of check, this tells you your system is under too much stress and you're beginning to become hormonally compromised. Likewise, if you're not able to attain and maintain optimal body composition, your hormonal system is becoming compromised. And finally, if your blood labs and vitals, in your case, testosterone is low and other cortisol is high and other blood labs and vitals are moving away from optimal, this is also an indication that your hormonal system is in dysregulation. And I'll say one final thing here. So if all three of those things are true, the first step, because that was your question, how do we begin to unpack this? The first step, if you're having these three things happen to you, the first step is to look at, am I putting myself under extreme duress or moderate duress over the long run? That needs to be taken into account. So the first step is to start putting yourself into rest and recovery, along with short bouts of intense adaptation type of signals. And most people miss this because they go, well, I'm training. And if I'm training, then I'm automatically dealing with stress. But for many people, training actually can become a stress if it's done too often, for too long, under depleted states. And that's what was happening with you. So I'll shut up right there for a little bit so you guys can begin to unpack that. And then we can get into when you might want to start using things like testosterone or performance enhancing hormones. But that hopefully gives you an overview of what's going on hormonally. And by the way, cortisol, insulin, and these hormones are far more important and will see changes first, as your doctor alluded to, before you start seeing changes in testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone.
Yeah, it's really, Bear and I were actually talking before we came on air regarding what you just said, is that especially in our world where everybody's working out, everybody is like maintaining a certain level of fitness. I'm a big proponent, and I say this to my friends all the time. I don't, if you've ever studied any of Paul Chek's work, he always says like the burnt toast analogy of like, he looks at somebody who is like fit sick, meaning they even may look good on the outside, but when you, and a lot of times you'll know by their sleep patterns, even just their kind of personality and how they show up, that like they're revved too hot, meaning like, as you said, the exercise that they're perceiving as a pro in their life actually has become just another stressor. So how do you, like, when you start to recognize that, what are some red flags for you? Is it purely kind of a blood draw to look at that? What do you start to look at there? And then what are some actions you start to take to mitigate somebody who maybe is just over revving their system?
Yeah, Tony, I love this question. And actually, blood labs, funnily enough, as a doc, a lot of people want to go to blood labs first. But as we were talking about with Bear's question, you're going to start seeing biofeedback signals change first. And they're far more useful in my mind, because long before your blood labs and your vitals will begin to change, you'll start seeing these changes in hunger, energy, and cravings, what I call HEC, HEC, or sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings, SHMEC. You'll see this pretty clearly. And by the way, let's make an analogy here that you two will, I think, appreciate. Let's take a couch potato, right, who's eating all the time and not moving at all. Their HEC and their SHMEC are out of check, right? They have these biofeedback signals out of check because they're under stress. But what we don't think about is, let's take the chronic dieter and chronic exerciser. They also have their HEC and SHMEC out of check because they're under stress. Now, what is the stress that's happening there? It is the gap between calorie intake and nutrient intake and output. So in the case of the couch potato, they're eating a ton, right? But they're not moving. So there's a huge calorie gap. But in the case of the chronic exerciser and dieter, they're not eating enough and burning a ton. So there's also a huge calorie gap. And the metabolism registers that as a severe stress. And we have not had that conversation enough. So yes, to your point, Tony, they might look good on the outside, but what we will begin to see is dysfunction, dysregulation, and perhaps even moving into disease. Now, we used to have a term that no one really likes in our industry of metabolic damage, because we didn't like the term because we don't want to think about the metabolism breaking. It's not broken. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. But when you push the stress lever too hard, it goes from stress to eustress, which is a good stress. You can adapt from that, to distress, if you keep pushing it, to dysfunction, to dysregulation, and finally to disease. And what we're happening here is we've never really had the discussion about cranking on that dial. So too many people think that they can just do more. Harder is better, but harder is not better. Better is better. The Goldilocks zone is better. You need enough, but not too much, just right. And that's the first thing that we need to help people understand. If you overdo this in either way, couch potato or dieter, you're going to run into issues. And I'll give you a hint here. There are two other metabolic toggles that we can use besides the eat more, exercise less, and the exercise more, eat less. We can train like a hunter-gatherer, which is really an eat less, move more, exercise less approach. They're walking a lot. They don't get a lot of calories because they wouldn't have been able to. And they're not doing, out there hoisting barbells and stuff like that. Another example of that would be the traditional Parisian. So that's like a eat less, exercise less approach. And then, of course, we've got the eat more, exercise more approach, which is like us three, right? These are athletes. These are people who, no athlete in his or her right mind, no Navy SEAL out that is going to purposely decrease their calories because they need that fuel to perform. And isn't it funny that most people want to look like athletes, yet they're doing something that no athlete would do in his or her right mind? So we have Now we have 4 different toggles. And this is where I start to answer your question, Tony, right? So we thought it was just eat less, exercise more, the dieter, and eat more, exercise less, the couch potato. But now when we're more savvy and really paying attention to how this works, now we can say, well, actually, there's 2 more toggles we can pull. We can go hunter-gatherer, eat less, exercise less, or we can go athlete, eat more, exercise more. And those 2 approaches narrow the calorie gap a little bit, cause less stress on the system, and people start seeing better results. Does that make sense? Because that, to me, is the first place that we need to start. And it's a smarter approach, not a harder approach.
Yeah, I think it was a very clear way to kind of lay it out in a very succinct way. I think the other piece of this that I'd love, that I know you've spent years kind of being involved and also being an expert on, is kind of the psychological component of this. Because a lot of what we're talking now are the physical components of, like, yeah, you may be working out too little, too much, but then your thoughts and belief systems are having a heavy influence over everything else downstream as well. Almost, I would put it even in front of those other things, like even diet, exercise. Like, of course, those are huge pillars of it, but go peel back the layers further enough, and you're going to run into your beliefs and thoughts, both about self and environment. So when you start to sense or recognize that somebody, either in yourself or clients you've worked with, maybe has a belief or a thought structure that is ramping up their perceived stress, which the body, and I think you may agree with this, the body doesn't know the difference between perceived stress and then actual stress. So when you're seeing somebody who may psychologically be in a place where they're hindering their ideal state, how do you approach something like that? Because there you're not talking anymore about eating less or eating more. You're getting into the complexity of the psyche, which is a whole nother animal. So how do you approach that, and what kind of insights do you have into that kind of realm?
Man, I'll tell you what, I just love you 2 guys. You guys are freaking brilliant, because to me, this is where the rubber meets the road, right? And you said, Tony, you said perception, the way someone perceives. And here's the interesting thing. Before you can think different, feel different, choose different, and act different, you have to see different. You have to see the world differently. And we miss this. And so the idea is, when I'm working with a client, I absolutely want to know how they're seeing the world and how they're perceiving stress. This is critical. And we have all the research in the world showing the way you perceive the world and how it's showing up to you is going to be greatly determine your ability to respond to that stress. So that's the first thing that I'll say. But the second part of your question was, how do we begin to deal with this? Well, we have to unpack another thing in my mind that the health and fitness industry gets completely wrong. And it's going to be interesting to see what you 2 think of this. So definitely challenge me on this. But, and this is going to be a controversial statement, but from my perspective, in this particular question, Tony, habits and behaviors are bullshit. And here's why they're bullshit: because habits and behaviors flow out of identity and beliefs. Okay. So the idea here, again, is that, just change your habits, just change your behaviors. But we know if you perceive yourself as not athletic, or you perceive yourself as something different around food, or you perceive food as something that is fun and tasty versus something that is fuel for performance, things are going to be different. And you can bang your head against the wall all day long with your habits and behaviors, but until you change the underlying stories that you tell, which are, by the way, stories are beliefs. Beliefs form your identity. Identity creates habits and behaviors. And so we have not been going deep enough. And this is where the study of psychology comes in, because we keep going, hey, just change your habits and beliefs. Do what Bear does, do what Tony does, do what Jade does, and you're going to look, feel, and function like Bear, Tony, and Jade. And it's not true, because they don't have the perceived identity as Bear, Tony, and Jade, because they've never practiced that. And so we need to begin to unpack that. And I'll give you the 3-part process, because I know the next question is, how the hell do we do that, Jade? Well, there's a 3-part process that we can follow. Number 1, we all have different beliefs and stories we tell about the world. And most of these beliefs come from our childhood narratives, childhood development, adolescent development, and young adult development. And when we're these ages, we don't have the maturity, the know-how, the tools, right? The understanding, the wisdom to make sense of some of the things that are happening in our world. And these don't have to be big traumas. They can just be struggles. So we are misguided because we don't have the tools and the wisdom. And these stories become unconscious because once we make these decisions when we're young, they get stored in our unconscious and they follow us around the rest of our lives. Actually, Carl Jung has a great quote on this. He says, but unless you make the unconscious conscious, it'll follow you around and you will call it fate. And so what we do when we're young, childhood development, adolescent development, and young adult development, is we form misguided unconscious decisions. Notice the acronym there, MUD. Misguided unconscious decisions that follow us around. So we get stuck in the mud about who it is that we think we are. So the first part of unraveling this psychology piece is to go back at those old narratives, those old stories that were formed during struggles, trials, tribulations, and even traumas as a kid, and begin to unpack them. By the way, just to give you a brief tool here, there are tools in science that we know work. Journaling is one. Several different journaling techniques will unravel these. Part two, by the way, is we need to retrain the nervous system to feel differently. This is where meditative practitioners come in. And then finally, and you two, I know are going to love this, but finally, the law of attraction, also kind of bullshit. The best, look at the word in there. The major word in law of attraction is action. So step three is you have to take action. But think about this: being in alignment, a human being means thinking, feeling, choosing, and acting in alignment, right? And so this three-part process does that. Unpack the old narratives, the misguided unconscious decisions, meditate and practice this new feeling in your nervous system, and then act. And when all three of those come together, we start to be able to unpack some of what you're speaking of here, Tony, because it is where the rubber meets the road. Bear and you and me can tell someone what to do all day long, but if their identity is stuck in a narrative that I'm not an exerciser, I don't like food, they're not getting results. And so this is the process that we need to be working on.